Welcome to everyone. I'm Clifford Orwin of the Department of Political Science, and it's my duty and pleasure to welcome you to this, the 22nd Annual Seymour Martin Lipset Memorial Lecture on Democracy in the World. I see many people in the audience who could be described as regulars, so you'll know the backstory of the lecture. For the benefit of the rest of you, this lecture is a joint production of the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, the Canadian Embassy in Washington, and then here in Toronto, the Department of Political Science, the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and the Donner Canadian Foundation, which is our generous local financial sponsor. The lecture memorializes Seymour Martin Lipset, who was a leading social scientist, both a political scientist and a sociologist, and in fact, the only scholar ever honored with the presidency of both the American Political Science Association and the American Sociological Association. Marty was also a pioneer scholar of the comparative sociology of Canada and the United States, so we thought it especially appropriate to honor him with the title of this lecture. And for each of the years from the second year onward, the lecture has been staged in two cities, Washington and Toronto. The speaker gives more or less the same lecture in both, although he or she is free to vary it according to the locale. There's one difference between the presentation here and the presentation in Washington, to which I want to call your attention. The people in Washington are very solicitous and sparing of the sensibilities of the speaker, and therefore they subject the speaker to just 15 minutes of Q&A, whereas we in Toronto, despite our reputation for greater civility, are in fact made of harder stuff and expect our speaker to be, and we therefore have a full hour of give and take following the lecture. So I hope that all of you will avail yourself of this opportunity to make yourself heard and to pose your questions to our distinguished speaker on the great issue that he's going to address. But I'm now going to turn over the podium to my colleague in the Department of Political Science and in organizing this lecture, Matthew Walton. Matt will introduce the speaker.
When Russia invaded and then annexed Crimea in February and March of 2014, the analysis of Russian-Ukrainian relations, as well as the broader post-Soviet political landscape, shifted drastically. The next Russian invasion of a significantly larger scale on February 24th, 2022, set off a new realignment and a radically rearranged political environment that leaders, policymakers, and communities in Ukraine, Europe, North America, and elsewhere have had to adapt to. Arguably, the results of the US presidential election on November 5th threw another wrench into that adaptation, although this is a wrench that we're already somewhat familiar with, at least. Major shifts in geopolitics such as these require grounded expertise and a longer sense of historical dynamics to help navigate. At our best, this is something that we as academics can contribute to. And in the fields of Ukrainian-Russian politics, intellectual history of Eastern Europe, and Cold War history, Serhii Plokhii is an essential figure. In his work, he marshals his masterful knowledge of Ukrainian history to be deployed in broader narratives that set Ukraine in its proper place as an important regional and global actor. Since 2007, Professor Plokhii has been the Mykhailo Hrushevs'kyi Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard, and since 2013, he's also been the director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. In this capacity, he leads the collaborative project MAPA, a digital atlas of Ukraine. The first act in his North American career was here in Canada at the University of Alberta, where he was part of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. The only word to describe his scholarly output is prodigious. It encompasses 20 books in just over 20 years, which is staggering and humbling, and frankly, as someone who is struggling to bring his second book to completion and publication, requires an extra moment for me to just take and sink in. His books have won numerous prizes, including the Lionel Gelber Prize and the Pushkin House Russian Book Prize in 2015 for The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union. In 2018, he was honored with the Shevchenko National Prize, the highest national award in Ukraine for contributions to arts and culture. His most recent works include last year's book, The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History, and this year's publication, Chernobyl Roulette, A War Story. Professor Plokhii also takes seriously his role as a public scholar, giving interviews in major media outlets, publishing across a wide range of popular platforms. And indeed, his 2021 book, The Frontline, was a collection of his essays on Ukraine's past and present. His insistence on labeling the current conflict the Russo-Ukrainian war holds a simple but important lesson in the power of words to shape our perceptions. While phrases like the Russian invasion or Russian aggression accurately point to the instigator of the conflict, he also argues that they undermine the agency of Ukraine, which is fighting this war as an equal, clearly, and has not only defended its territory, but also successfully launched its own offensives into Russian territory. Also relevant for today's lecture and this series is the fact that woven throughout his historical narratives are observations about the changing dynamics of democracy in the world, as well as essential democratic values. Given the cultural and political diversity of Ukraine, as well as the challenges that the country has faced in building and maintaining democratic institutions, he certainly has sufficient material to work with. But in all of his work on the country, he is insightful and honestly reflexive in assessing Ukraine's successes and failures in that respect. Giving a talk today entitled David versus Goliath, Democracy and Autocracy in the Russo-Ukrainian War. Please join me in welcoming Professor Serhii Plokhii.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for the introduction. Thank you very much for this introduction, and thanks a lot for inviting me to give a talk here. Thanks to all of you for coming to this presentation. So the talk is, the title is David and Goliath, and that's exactly where I'm going to start my today's presentation. The biblical story of David and Goliath, a young shepherd called David, depicts a battle between a much weaker entity, in that particular case, David, and Goliath, and the outcome of that battle is most unexpected, almost as unexpected as the Ukrainian resistance to the Russian aggression in February and March of the year 2022 was. Well, David defeats Goliath with the help of a sling and 5 stones, and Ukraine's stones come in different forms and from different places. Some of them are Ukraine-made, like drones, including sea drones. Others are American and Western-made, like missiles. But the sling itself has been made in Ukraine. And to continue this metaphor, I would say that it is made mostly out of Ukrainians' beliefs and dedication to ideas of freedom, independence, and democracy. And it is democracy as a key value that Ukrainians defend today that I am going to focus on in this lecture. I'll start by talking about the fate of democracy after the fall of the Soviet Union. I will talk about the democracy and autocracy in Russia, in Ukraine, the democracy and geopolitics in the way how the war started and how it has been conceptualized, both on the Ukrainian and on the Russian side. And I will conclude with the future of democracy and the importance that this war and the outcome of that war has and will have for democracy not only in Ukraine or in the region, but also democracy globally. So this is the plan, and I roughly have up to 1 hour, maybe 50 minutes, and please bear with me. In the minds of many of us, history had reached its end with the fall of the Berlin Wall. If not in Francis Fukuyama's understanding of that fall as the ultimate victory of liberal democracy as a form of political order, then in the conviction that despite continuing rivalry between great powers, unprovoked invasions, followed by territorial annexations and large-scale military actions had been relegated to the past. There had been clear signs to the contrary. The wars in Chechnya, the former Yugoslavia, and then Afghanistan and Iraq, but we preferred to ignore them. The rise of populism and authoritarian regimes, as well as authoritarian tendencies in democratic nations, suggested parallels with the 1930s, but most of us brushed them aside. The fall of the USSR, far from being a universal triumph of democracy, as was imagined back in 1991, was a victory to a different degree of nationalists, Democrats, party apparatchiks, with their roles and ideologies varying from one country to another, from one republic to another. In some cases, it was the most conservative elements of the Soviet elite or communist and post-communist elite that consolidated power. Democracy was fully successful in the former Soviet space only in the Baltic states, where it turned out to be more durable and resistant to authoritarian pressures than even in the countries of the former Eastern European communist bloc, and I have first and foremost in mind Hungary, and Poland to a degree as well. Democracy in the form of competitive elections survived in Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, and to a degree in Kyrgyzstan, an outlier among Central Asian states in that regard. It never took off in the rest of Central Asia, including Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan. In Belarus, the slide into authoritarianism began in the mid-1990s after the election of Alexander Lukashenko as president of that country. His regime became a virtual dictatorship by the year 2020, when he used unrestricted violence against peaceful demonstrators who protested the government's widespread electoral fraud committed to keep Lukashenko in office. In neighboring Russia, the beacon of democracy for the more conservative republics in the late 1980s and early 1990s, authoritarianism began to gather strength after the political crisis in that country in the fall of 1993. It was the largest armed conflict to break out on the streets of Moscow since the Russian Revolution of 1917. On the morning of October 4, 1993, 6 T-60 tanks of the elite Taman Guards Motor Rifle Division took position on the new Arbat Bridge, spanning the Moskva River across from the Russian parliament building known as the White House. Sometime after 9 a.m., the tanks opened fire, aiming at the floors housing the offices of the parliamentary leadership. For Yeltsin, this was a second battle for the White House in slightly more than 2 years. During the hardline coup against Mikhail Gorbachev in August 1991, Yeltsin had led the defense of the building, which had become a symbol of Russian democracy. Now, in 1993, he led the government troops in their assault on the very same parliament, which was being protected by his top lieutenant of August 1991. Yeltsin prevailed in both struggles. Russian democracy did not. Saved from destruction by Soviet tanks in August 1991, it was all but destroyed by Russian tanks in October of 1993. In December 1993, Russian citizens voted on the new constitution drafted by Yeltsin's aide. "I won't deny it," was saying Yeltsin at the time. "The powers of the president in the draft are considerable indeed. And what would you want?" I keep quoting Yeltsin. "In a country that has got used to tsars or chiefs, a country in which well-defined interest groups have not coalesced and their leaders have not been determined, in which normal parties are barely embryonic, a country in which executive discipline is exceedingly weak, where nihilism with regard to the law is completely rampant, in such a country could one bet only on mainly on parliament. In half a year, if not sooner, the people are sure to demand a dictator. Such a dictator will be found quickly, I assure you, and perhaps in that very parliament." So Yeltsin was declaring, in effect, that Russia was not ready for democracy and presenting himself as its savior from an even more evil, a dictatorship. He was right. Most of us were wrong who had high hopes for Russian democracy in the early 1990s. But Yeltsin was right. The country that had no experience with democracy for centuries and decades before 1991 had no chance to become a democracy overnight. All these heightened expectations in the West, in Russia itself, in other republics, were really hopes for the better. They were delusions and illusions at the time. With the new authoritarian, constitution in place, Russia continued its slide back into the past that allegedly it just left with the Yeltsin's revolt in defense of democracy during the coup, August coup of 1991 in Moscow. Yeltsin believed that he had the right and indeed the responsibility to choose the successor. The tryouts for president in what had become known as Operation Successor brought to power the former director of the Federal Security Service and Secretary of the Security Council, Vladimir Putin. We know what followed. We know what happened after that. Switching to Ukraine, Ukraine faced the same sort of challenges when it came to the continuing existence of democracy, when it came to the economic downturn on the territory of the entire Soviet Union, but Ukraine had chosen a different path. In mid-1990s, Russia and Ukraine part ways in political development. Russia became more authoritarian with each passing year, while Ukraine stayed democratic despite repeated efforts of the presidential office, Ukraine's presidential office, to follow the Russian model and subordinate parliament to itself. Numerous factors contributed to these different outcomes, which would strongly affect relations between the two former senior partners of the Soviet project. And I quote here a professor of political science who is present here, Lucan Wei. I didn't add this quote just for the talk here in Toronto. I'm going to, that part of the talk will also be presented in Washington. So here is a quote. Ukraine became the most competitive and democratic country in the Commonwealth of Independent States over the post-Cold War era, experiencing 4 electoral turnovers, a vibrant media, and repeated mass movements for political challenge. According to Lucan Wei, Ukraine's surprising pluralism was rooted in underdeveloped ruling parties, a weak authoritarian state, and national divisions between Eastern and Western Ukraine. Overall, leaders had little capacity to keep allies in line, manipulate the electoral processes, starve opponents of resources, and violently suppress opposition challenge. As a historian, I will add to that characteristic a couple of other factors that, in my opinion, contributed to the longevity of Ukrainian democratic experience when in other countries, in most countries of the Soviet Union, the electoral democracy in particular, failed. One of them is, of course, the history of the country that for centuries was divided between the different imperial powers, with the regionalism and regional identity being extremely strong in Ukraine, and no particular one region emerging in the position that would be able to somehow control or suppress the voices of other countries or other regions and other historical groupings that came into existence in Ukraine as the result of its historical development. Another very important factor was the Ukraine's relation to the state, which historically in Ukraine never since at least 17th century represented the local elites, where the decision makers were not living or taking those decisions on the territory of Ukraine. in which conditions the state almost always was viewed as a foreign. And for Ukrainians, the biggest challenge after 1991 was how to domesticate a state, how to live in the state of their own. When for Russians, the biggest challenge was actually in the early 1990s, how to imagine themselves outside of the state that was crumbling, how to live in the state that is and was weak. So this regionalism in Ukraine and also different relations toward the state in Russia and Ukraine, in my opinion, should be viewed also as contributing factor to the surprising survival of democracy in Ukraine that in 1991, when Yeltsin was getting on the tank, was considered, and for very good reason, one of the most conservative republics in the Soviet Union, under the strong control of the local Communist Party that were the holdovers from the time of Leonid Brezhnev and his rule over the Soviet Union. The key year in this parting ways between Russia and Ukraine in terms of democracy was the year 1996. That was the year when Yeltsin was re-elected as the president, despite the fact that he was extremely unpopular, was elected as the result of the manipulation of the electoral system, the huge amount of money that was put into the elections by the people who became known as oligarchs. And in Ukraine, exactly at the same time, in 1996, a very different kind of a constitution was adopted, different, I mean, from the one that was adopted in Russia in 1993. Leonid Kuchma, who was the president of Ukraine at that time, wanted a new constitution that would very much follow in the footsteps of the constitution that was adopted by Yeltsin in 1993, but parliament resisted those attempts. Following in Yeltsin's footsteps, Kuchma threatened to put his own draft constitution to a referendum. Knowing from Russian experience where that could lead, Parliament decided to compromise. Urgency was added by the 1996 presidential elections in Russia, in which a communist candidate had a good chance of beating Yeltsin. Fears grew in Kiev that with a communist at the helm in Russia and communists making up the largest faction in the Ukrainian parliament, they might try to resurrect the Soviet Union. As the result, the presidential administration in Ukraine and the parliament reached a compromise, which was solidified in the new Ukrainian constitution. It was a power-sharing agreement where the president acquired the right to veto laws adopted by the parliament and even to dissolve the parliament under the certain circumstances. But parliament gained a decisive role in appointing the prime minister and key cabinet ministers, including the head of the National Bank. Parliament also placed its representatives on the Constitutional Court and the Board of National Bank. The Ukrainian constitution didn't allow the president to serve in office for more than 2 terms, and Kuchma again reached for the Russian playbook and tried to play or bring to Ukraine the Operation Successor. That successor was the governor of the Donetsk Oblast in Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, who had led the largest grouping in the pro-presidential faction of the parliament. Ukraine, by the year 2004, with a different constitution than in Russia, but was really testing the Russian scenario of the successor being elected through the pressure by the government, by the state, use the police forces and using money. We know what came out of that. Out of that came the revolution, the Orange Revolution of 2004, because the revolution of 2004 exactly stopped in Ukraine what happened in Russia a few years earlier with appointment of Putin as successor of Yeltsin. Here, that process in Ukraine was stopped. So by the year 2004, Ukraine acquired not only a constitution that was a compromise between the parliamentary and presidential branches of power, it also insisted on the importance of elections and fair elections as the way of changing power in Kyiv, when in Moscow that the elections as pro forma stayed, but really the way how the new leaders were arriving in Kyiv was not decided by the electorate, but through the system of successors, and Putin was actually successful in continuing in the same tradition with this shift between him and Prime Minister Medvedev, where they changed the positions for a short period of time before Putin came back to power in Russia and ended even the operation, or the model of the successor in Moscow. Ukrainian democracy presented a major threat to the Russian political regime, as it provided an example of a functioning political system with a strong parliament, which encouraged and empowered Russian liberal opposition to the increasingly authoritarian regime in Moscow. Apart from that, the Ukrainian democratic tradition and parliamentary system made it much more difficult for Russia to regain control over Ukraine. Furthermore, Western insistence on democratic rule as a prerequisite for good relations with the post-Soviet states privileged Ukraine in building long-term political ties with Europe and the United States, and the governments in US, in Canada, in Europe insisted on dealing with the democratic governments. For them, it was important the proper treatment of the opposition, fair elections, and so on and so forth. As far as Russia was concerned, the victory of the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine was a major blow to Kremlin's interests at home and abroad. It was our 9/11, declared the Russian political advisor Gleb Pavlovsky, who was close at that time to the Kremlin. By 2004, Putin was well on the way to laying the foundations for a future autocratic regime in Russia. He took control of the Russian Duma in the December 2003 elections, which saw his party, United Russia, obtain 3 times as many votes as the communists to become the largest party in the parliament. He then exploited a hostage crisis produced by Chechen radicals who attacked a school in Beslan in September 2004. It was mishandled by the Russian security services, whose personnel stormed the school, contributing to the death of 314 hostages, including 186 schoolchildren. This gave Putin an opportunity to intervene and curtail whatever remained of Russian democracy. Elections of regional governors were abolished, and new laws were introduced curtailing the activities of political parties and NGOs. President George W. Bush's democracy crusade, or policies designed to promote and support democracy on a global scene, became an important factor in relations between Moscow and Kyiv during the first decade of the 21st century. Putin's regime found democracy promotion a threat to its stability at home and his political objectives abroad. The new Eastern Europe, the former Western republics of the USSR, became the site where those competing interests collided to the same degree as they did in the old Eastern Europe during the Cold War. Meanwhile, for Ukraine, democracy became a major tool in its international politics. And I'm sorry, I just realized that I was focusing on the text and on the ideas and completely neglected the images that I prepared for you. So I will just go through them into the...
Oh, God.
Okay.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Okay, yeah, that's That was the parliament. That is the operation successor bringing its results. This is the Orange Revolution. And now we are moving to the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War, to 2013-2014, the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, and the annexation of the Crimea. When in early 2014, the Revolution of Dignity in Kiev overthrew the Moscow-backed corrupt regime of President Yanukovych, and the new government insisted on the signing of the association agreement between Ukraine and European Union, the association agreement that, in the minds of many Ukrainians, were there to provide a guarantee that the democratic freedoms of Ukrainians would be protected now also on the international level. So once that happened, Putin called the development in Kiev a coup and moved his troops in the Crimea, ostensibly in defense of the rights of its Russian-speaking population, almost the same way how Catherine II, back in the 18th century, destroyed the democratic Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in defense, allegedly, of the liberties of its citizens. So by 2014, putting fully the electoral system in the Russian Federation under control of the authoritarian regime, Putin emerged at home but also on the international arena as a defender of the status quo, as the defender of the sort of the quote-unquote democracy that was established at that time in Moscow, in good part of the Central Asian republics, and also in Belarus, treating the protests of the population and the activists like of the sort that were happening during the Orange Revolution of 2004, the revolution of roses in Georgia, the revolution of tulips in Kyrgyzstan around the same time, and then the revolution of dignity, as attack not only on the state, not only on the constitution, but also attack on democracy. So by 2014, Putin emerges as the defender of a particular type of democracy which was in fact authoritarian regime that he established in Russia. And in that sense, his treatment of the Revolution of Dignity of 2014 as a coup and his attempt to protect the rights of Russian-speaking minorities are very, very representative of that approach. But there was also one more element of Putin's warfare on Ukraine and on other countries in the region, including Georgia, that deserve the attention. And this is the use of referenda. Putin originally denied that he was planning to annex the Crimea, despite the fact that the Russian military already took over the Crimea in late February and early March of 2022. But the Crimean parliament, to which the members of the parliament were dragged into the building by Igor Girkin and his thugs and forced to vote for whatever Kremlin wanted them to vote, voted for the forthcoming referendum, putting the question of the reunification of the Crimea and Russia on the agenda. So what we see is the takeover of the parliament. That was the first building in the Crimea that the Russian army took over, dragging in the members of the parliament, forcing them to vote in a particular way, and then providing referendum on the basis of that decision. The turnout at that referendum, according to independent estimates, was anywhere between 30 and 50%. And according to the same estimates, between 50 and 80% of those taking part voted for quote-unquote reunification. That was sufficient for Putin's purposes, but Moscow needed a decisive victory. When the official results of the referendum were announced, they reminded many of Soviet-era elections. 96 and 8% had allegedly voted in favor of reunification, and the turnout was announced to have been 83%. This is the model. The following day, on March 17th, the count was already complete, and the Crimean parliament asked the Russian authorities to accept the peninsula as part of their territory. That is celebration in Moscow later, already in 2014, when the same scenario was adopted for the occupied parts of Donbass and also of southern Ukraine. So, but going back to the Crimea, in the article published on the eve of referendum, the historian Andrei Zubov, a professor at the elite Moscow Institute of International Relations, compared the annexation of the peninsula to Hitler's Anschluss of Austria in 1938. He drew parallels between Hitler's vision of Greater Germany and Russia's reunification rhetoric, pointed out that both acts were justified to the public by the need to protect allegedly persecuted minorities, German in Czechoslovakia in the first case and Russian in the case of Ukraine. Zubov was soon dismissed, losing his prestigious position at the country's top diplomatic school. He didn't lose, though, he lost his job, he didn't lose his argument. He is now in Czech Republic, it seems to me, at the University of Brno, and puts on the website his lectures on the history of the Soviet Union. In the Ukrainian Donbass in 2014, Russian and separatist propaganda mobilized votes for the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. The referendums that took place in May 2014 were organized even more hastily than the one in the Crimea, and the organized predictably declared victory for the pro-independence side, which in reality, of course, meant that the parts of the Donbass that were taken were taken under the Russian control, were supplied and were controlled from Moscow. Of course, now independence was in the sight. When in the summer of 2021, Putin began preparing for the all-out invasion of Ukraine, he published a pseudo-historical tract on the historical ties between Russia and Ukraine. At least one paragraph there also dealt with democracy. Putin was clearly upset with the Ukrainian democracy that kept generating political leaders dedicated to the idea of independence of Ukraine. He complained, and I quote, that presidents, members of parliament, and ministers would change, but the attitude of separation from and enmity toward Russia would remain, end of quote. According to Putin, that was the result of the political system established by, I quote, the Western authors of the anti-Russia project. What he had in mind in reality was democracy. The democracy kept producing the leaders with whom Putin had difficulty making deals, like he was trying to make a deal with Yanukovych. That particular paragraph, I will not continue citing Putin, but he goes immediately after the sitting president at that time of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, saying that, okay, there were one sort of promises when he was running for the office, and now he is actually making things even worse for pro-Russian orientation of Ukraine. And after the original success of the Russian occupying forces in eastern and southern Ukraine, taking over parts of the Donetsk, Luhansk Oblast, and also the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson Oblast, Putin declared in the fall of 2022 or launched the referenda on the territory of those occupied territories. On September 30th, 2022, Putin cited, I quote, the will of the millions, and signed decrees formally annexing 4 oblasts of Ukraine to Russia. 3 of those oblasts were only partially occupied by Russia. In the oblast, in my native oblast of Zaporizhzhia, the city of Zaporizhzhia, which is the population at that time was 750,000 people, now it's significantly less than that, was and remains still today to be under the Ukrainian control. Ironically, that at the time when Putin was delivering his speech on the annexation and including into the Russian constitution on the basis of so-called referenda, those oblasts, not all of them were under the Russian control, but actually the Ukrainian forces in September and October of 2022 went on the counteroffensive, taking over the territories that were declared part of Russia. Today, unfortunately, Russia is on the offensive again, trying to capture the territories that it declared its own on the basis of faked referenda. The democracy being turned on its head is once again put in the service of authoritarian regime, and it is authoritarianism rather than democracy when you look at how the Frontline is moving that is on the offensive and is succeeding today in Ukraine. Most of what I talked till now was dealing with the failure of Russian democracy, high hopes for Russian democracy, failure of Russian democracy, use of referenda as the tool of first internal politics in Russia. That's how Yeltsin was trying to get to the constitution, how he tried to create a presidential republic, and then using of referenda as pseudo-democratic instrument to annex territories of Ukraine. But what about Ukraine itself? I left the discussion of Ukraine with the discussion of the revolution of 2004, with the constitution of 96, which was very different from the Russian one, and also with the failure of the successor model in the Ukrainian politics. The war, especially the all-out war, of course, presented major challenges to the Ukrainian democracy. The latest discussion of democracy per se in the media, in Ukrainian media, in Western media, were dealing with the election of the president, in particular, election of the parliament as well. Under the Ukrainian constitution, the elections didn't take place, didn't happen, because the state of emergency, the state of war, doesn't allow to conduct those elections. Russia was trying also to use the idea that Zelensky allegedly stopped being legitimate president in the spring and in the summer of this year. But it is interesting that the polling data coming from Ukraine suggests that actually the Ukrainians insisted that elections should not take place in the conditions of the war. They didn't want that to happen. This is not something that the presidential administration, Zelensky, people around him, pushed or forced on the Ukrainian people. And in a very particular way, there is actually the growing support for the democratic values in Ukraine as the result of this war. There have been a number of very interesting publications authored and published in the year 2022 and 2023, including by Ukrainian journalists. One of them, Natalia Humenyuk, published very impressive piece in the summer of 2022 about her interviews with the Ukrainian soldiers and officers on the front line, where the majority of people with whom she had conversations were talking about the reason why they were on the front line. They were formulating that in terms of the defense of freedom and defense of democracy. Ukraine is fighting back against the Russian aggression, crossing the lines, the ethnic, linguistic, and religious lines between different citizens of Ukraine. The most obvious example of the fact that it's not just the Ukrainians that are trying for or fighting for Ukrainian independence comes from the videos that people probably see coming from the front lines, where Ukrainians fights back in two languages, in Ukrainian and in Russian. The Minister of Defense today of Ukraine is Crimean Tatar. The President of Ukraine today is of Jewish background, Volodymyr Zelensky. In October 2022, Olga Onuch, a political scientist whom many probably of you know in this room, published a piece in the Journal of Democracy, where she wrote, instead of losing confidence in democracy as the best form of government, however, Ukrainian citizens have done the opposite. Survey research from Mobilize Project reveals a staggering 35 percentage point rise in Ukraine's support for democracy over just 3 years. So that was, okay, that's the commander-in-chief of the Russian forces today, General Serhii, born in Russia, ethnic Russian. And it's in Ukrainian, but I will explain you what those two columns mean. So in the year 2023, 54% of Ukrainians believed that it was important in the conditions of the war to have a strong leader, and 31% believed that the most important thing is maintaining the democratic system. Sorry, that's the data that I gave you was coming from October 2020, before the start of the war. So I'll repeat again. So 54% were saying that the strong leader is the most important thing. 31% believe that democratic system is the most important one. In December of 2023, 59% of Ukrainians said that democratic system is the most important thing to maintain in the conditions of the war. And the percentage of those who believed that the most important thing is to have a strong leader fell to 32%. Data coming from summer of 2024 of this year, from July 2024, 61% of people polled in Ukraine consider democracy to be the most effective way of governing Ukraine. And 47% of Ukrainians believe that if they have to choose between freedom and material well-being, they were choosing freedom, 77%. 24% believed that they would choose the material well-being over freedom. So 47 versus 24, the data from July of 2024. So Ukrainians are fighting for democracy and articulated their readiness to do that, not because they want to impress the West, and not because they believe that this is the way how they could get more support, financial or military support. They are articulating their own identity in opposition to Russia and to the Russian authoritarian regime, using the language, using the vocabulary provided by democracy, and defending their political experience that came with the functioning electoral democracy that was there in Ukraine since 1991. The war in 2013, 2014, and then after that, with the annexation of the Crimea, with takeover of parts of Donbass of eastern Ukraine, showed to the Ukrainians in 2022 that actually they had a lot to lose in case of the Russian occupation of their territory. They knew what happened in the Crimea, they knew what happened in Donbass. And that was not just about the economic choices, because in Crimea, the economy suffered, but not suffered significantly after the takeover. It was completely almost destroyed in Donbass. But for them, the important thing was that their power to elect, their power to live the way how they considered to be necessary to live, was taken away from them by Russian occupation. In this dedication to the ideas of democracy and the democratic way of life is also one of the secrets of why everyone in 2022, from Washington to Moscow to Brussels, was wrong, believing that the Ukrainians would not fight, and that the Ukrainians would actually not, Ukraine would not last for more than 3 days or 2 weeks. One of the reasons why Ukrainians were fighting back in different languages, Ukrainians belonging to different ethnic groups and different religions, was this common ground that was produced by the understanding that democracy is something that needed to be protected, something that would actually be taken away from them. And that was important for them to defend that value. A lot will depend on the outcome of this war in terms of the future of democracy for Ukraine, for region, and world in general. The Western support for Ukraine is very often presented, mobilized, justified, explained by the idea that the democratic countries are there to support Ukraine in this fight of democracy against autocracy. This is certainly something that you can see, that the references to democracy and to democratic Ukraine, you can see in the pronouncements of presidents and prime ministers from North America to Europe, everywhere. But the reality, if you look on the map of the countries that support Ukraine and fight of Ukraine for independence, and those who do not or who are on the sidelines, you will see that, yes, the majority of the democratic countries are there in support of Ukraine, but others, including the largest democracy in the world, India, is not there at all. So something that is clearly emerging from this map, but also from the development of the international relations in the course of the last 3 years, that the democratic camp in the world is not united at all. If the largest democracy in the world is not there, this is a serious problem. We also see democracy being under attack in the democratic countries as the result of the rising populism. We don't know, we just lived through the elections in the United States of America. We don't know actually what will happen with the American democracy. And this fight for democracy is actually interconnected. In that sense, what Ukraine is doing is fighting not only to defend its own democratic values and democratic experience, but also for democratic values outside of the country, outside of the region. It goes without saying that the future of democracy of Ukraine will depend on the outcome of this war. We know what happened with the Crimea. We know what happened in eastern Ukraine. We know what is happening on the occupied parts of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson oblasts. Democracy is, if the word is used there at all, it is used as a derogatory term to attack the West, to attack Ukrainian government. The line, the front line today in Ukraine is the line between democracy and autocracy. And that line is moving, and it is moving in the Western, in the Western direction. That line, as a minimum, has to be stopped. The future of democracy in Russia, it's another question that should be considered. I started my presentation with recalling, and I was certainly there, and probably many people who are in this room, not all, but some at least were there in 1989, 1990, 91, the period of the high hopes for the transformation of Russia and Russian democracy. Few people have illusions today that Russia can be transformed into democracy into a short period of time. Maybe in some historical future, but probably not within the next year, two or three decades, the countries that have no experience with democracy, that has close association with the authoritarian states for most of their history, they can move toward democracy, but they can't actually do that overnight and within a short period of time. So the idea of saving Russia should be put aside. Russia is not going to be democratic, but Russia can be and should be much less authoritarian inside of its borders. And certainly the threat to the democracy worldwide should be stopped, and not only in Ukraine, but also in Europe, also in the United States of America, and also in Canada. So whether Russia becomes democratic or not, the key task is really to stop the rise of authoritarianism and support of anti-democratic tendencies worldwide. The war certainly will influence the prospects of democracy in the world, in Europe, and also here in North America. It matters a lot who will win and who will lose in this war. The Russo-Ukrainian war is the largest war in Europe since 1945. If you don't count the number of Chinese troops on the front lines in Korea, this is the largest war in the world since 1945. If you look at the number of tanks, if you look at the sort of the destruction that is being caused, when you look at the war crimes, and it matters who loses and who wins in the wars of that proportion. You can forget for a second about Ukraine, about Russia, think about just the historic significance of the war of that proportions. It mattered who won and who lost in World War II. It will mean who will win and who will lose in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Returning to David and Goliath story. Ukrainians are fighting today for the future of democracy, not only at home, but also abroad. And for the sake of all of us, David of democracy has to defeat the Goliath of authoritarianism. We know that for sure that he can't do that without support of his democratic allies. And because at stake, it's not just the fate of democracy in Ukraine. At stake is the fate of democracy globally in the world. I will end here my presentation. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I really look forward to the questions, comments, and discussion. Time-wise, it looks like I'm within my time. We still have close to 1 hour for that. Thank you once again. Yes.
Hello, my name is Anna Lysenko. I'm a recent graduate of the International Relations Specialist Program here at the University of Toronto. Дуже дякую за ваш час, за вашу лекцію. And I know you're a historian, so you look at patterns across time, but I would like to know what you have seen in the last 3 years of this full-scale war that are things you think are unprecedented, and particularly unprecedented moments that make you worry for Ukraine's current state and its future, and potentially moments that you've considered unprecedented in history that give you hope. Дякую.
Thank you. This mic work? Okay, it looks like I can rely on this mic. So first of all, really as a historian, I was looking and still look at this war, trying to find patterns that are supposed to help me to understand what is going on and then explain to others. And I look at the war as something that is familiar for historians in general. This is the war of the disintegration of empire. This is a war for independence of Ukraine. That story starts at least with the American Revolution in the 18th century. We know that similar processes on a certain level were happening in the 19th and 20th century. In 1991, there was a feeling that not only the end of history and the victory of liberal democracy, but also that somehow things are not the way how they used to be. The largest empire, one of the largest territorial empires in the world, disintegrated without a major war, major calamity. Stephen Kotkin wrote a book, Armageddon Averted. So the concern was the disintegration of empire was happening also in the conditions of the nuclear age. Nuclear arms were there. And now with this huge war in Ukraine, the largest since World War II, as I just mentioned, we see that the largest empire in the world goes down with a big splash. So that's on the one hand gives me perspective and gives me hope. We know how wars of that kind end. We know that empires fall. We know that the countries that emerge on their ruins become successful countries. Where my concern comes from, also as a historian, I know that the process of disintegration of empire can be a very lengthy one. One can look at Ottoman Empire as one of the examples of that. So it's my historical lenses that give me both optimism looking forward, help to categorize, help to explain to myself what I see, but also that give me big concern, because I think I know the outcome, but what I don't know is the timeline. So thank you for your question.
Yes.
Monty McMurtry, an alumnus who has spent some time in regions abroad in post-conflict development, which means I don't know very much. I commend you on your insight. To me, I'm going to pose what I term the leadership test, evinced in how we phrase the denigration of Biden. A very decent individual, but he has utterly failed the leadership test. Whereas Zelensky, no one had very high expectations, but for some reason, he capitalized. He found it within himself to do what needed to be done, as you alluded to very well, that there was passion, that if we're going to fail or muck things up, we want to muck it up by ourselves without any external intervention. If we are going to succeed, we want to do it ourselves. What do you suggest, or what is your prognostication in terms of, because Zelensky right now, he's running out of time. Putin is banking in different aspects that he will able to prevail in the short to medium term, whereas Zelensky is literally fighting for his metaphorical life as well as his country. Too little, too late in terms of weapons. War is blood. War, you kill. There is no in between. There's no such thing as what I call the noble war. War is messy, it's dirty. If you do it once and you do it right.
Sure, thank you. I gave you figures on the growing number of people who think that democratic system is more important than strong leader. I think partially this is also a vote of disapproval of Zelensky in the course of at least last year. So people more believe in the democracy as a system than in the strong leader. The support for Zelensky in 2022 was exceptionally high. This shift happens, it's natural shift that happens with the war actually continuing. War being extremely difficult for Ukraine and Ukrainians. And there is no clear perspective or clear understanding of how and where it would end. The future of Zelensky beyond the war, that was not exactly the question that you asked, but maybe a related question. I think will be a test, at least from my perspective as a historian, a test for Ukraine, how whether Ukrainian democracy is mature enough, whether it would actually follow in the footsteps of the way how other democratic countries dealt with the wartime leaders. We see that with the peace coming, the electorate wants to move beyond the leaders and traumatic memories that are associated with them. From de Gaulle to Pilsudski in Poland to a degree Churchill in United Kingdom, there is an appetite for new leaders. And if Ukraine actually, the democracy is mature enough, if it stays, most likely there would be someone else to replace Zelensky once the war is over. But what we also know from the history of France, United States, UK, and so on and so forth, that the wartime leaders actually come back. Once the way how people think about the past, the war becomes a more heroic part of their memory than the memory of suffering. So it will be, if only from that perspective, it would be interesting how Ukraine handles elections, how Ukraine handles democracy after the war is over. But first, the war has to be over. And democracy in Ukraine, Ukraine itself, Ukrainian people have to be protected, and it's not given. We don't know what will happen. The solidarity of democratic countries, again going back to conclusion of my talk, is probably more important today than it was at any point in this war. Thank you.
Yes, Ms. in the back.
Hello, I'm Olena Mykhailo, an economist and university professor from Kiev. Actually, I lived through all these events that you were talking about. And in my opinion, I think that understanding of this battle between democracy and non-democracy is something bigger than it would be understood, for example, in the United States or in Canada. It's also a very deep fear, hate, historical resentment, which was growing on KGB practices, Soviet Union experience, even further, like Oriental despotism of Golden Horde, that history of, Russia, which inherited more from Mongolian invasion, and it was staying there longer than it was in Ukraine, though Kiev was also under that particular time. So when Ukrainians fight against Russia, it's not only clearly between democracy and not democracy, though it's the main thing, but it's also like desperate fear not to get there again, not to become like Russians with their extreme inhumanity, cruelty, hierarchy, power distance, and everything like that. What do you think?
First of all, I certainly agree with you that democracy is just one of the factors that drives Ukrainian resistance. There is a lot of things that are connected to that, associated with the political culture, associated with the value of human life. We see what is happening today on the front line, where the Russians sign up soldiers for $100,000 or something like that and sending them into the, really for slaughter. On the daily basis now, it's 1,500 Russians who are being killed in the battle, and that sort of political system that does that, Ukrainians don't want to be part of that. So that's, you're absolutely right. All of that, you can't capture that with just one term, with one set of values, which are democratic values. There are others as well. In that sense, it's really very important that for Ukrainians, including for Ukrainian political thought, already since 19th century, the world emerged with the two poles, and one was associated with Russia, with the Tsarist Russia, with the repression, authoritarian regime, the serfdom that good part of Ukraine, especially under the Cossack control, didn't have at all. And then another counterpole emerged as Europe. And that is also one of the reasons why you see the European flags on Maidan in 2004 and then in 2013, 2014. So the term are European values. This is a broader package than just democracy, but democracy is an important part of that story. And for Ukraine really to survive, it has to stay democratic. Authoritarianism didn't work in Ukraine. I was talking about President Kuchma and trying to rewrite the constitution and trying to do the successor scenario. But there were any attempts at this move in authoritarian direction produced Maidans, produced revolutions. And the alternative that was presented was Europe. So now it's not just the issue of European values, now it becomes the issue of security, including the issue of the question of NATO, European economic structures, European security structures, plus, of course, European democracy. And that orientation of Ukraine is really very important because to be a member of the European Union, to be a member of the European community, you also have to prove your democratic credentials. Of course, we have Hungary and we have Poland at some point. It's not all very clear cut, but still it has to be a functioning democracy, which on the one hand, Ukraine needs to survive. On the other hand, it's also the way, this is the ticket. This is the way how to become part of Europe, which is associated in Ukraine with a different set of values. So thank you for your comment.
Yes, go ahead, Ms. Oh, let's see. Okay, right here, yeah, fine. Yeah.
We have to deal with the elephant in the room and what's going on in the U.S. and how that stands in Ukrainian attitudes for democracy. In a certain way, what some see now as a failure of American democracy and declining influence of America in the democratic world, while on the other hand, at least from the perspective of Kyiv, I would guess Britain looks quite good as a major supporter. The Baltic countries and the Nordic countries are supporters and also democratic. Does that give Ukrainians a certain greater confidence? I realize that they need the U.S. to provide the arms that they need, but how do you see what's going on in the U.S. influencing Ukrainian attitudes towards democracy, and how much will it get, in a certain way, redirected towards other countries that are somewhat closer to the Ukrainian model?
Well, my understanding is that Ukrainians are, of course, probably the most concerned group today, or the group that is concerned the most when it comes to the American elections and the potential changes in the American foreign policy. So for them, it is the question literally of survival. Many in the United States believe that the turn in the American politics, that's the matter of survival, but it's more metaphorical. In Ukraine, it's literary, it's not metaphorical. And the expectations from the United States and relations with the United States, it's not really very much focused today on democracy per se. It's more geopolitical thinking and more geopolitical considerations. For Ukraine, the democracy is the most important issue in terms of their relations at home, domestically, the power of the presidential administration, the ability of the channels to discuss war, TV channels. So when my understanding is when Ukrainians think about democracy, they don't think at this point about geopolitical, really, implications of being democratic or not, but it's about their country. They're very protective of democracy in the conditions of the war. They're very concerned about limits on democracy that are put by the war, and the majority of them are accepting that willingly. They understand that there should be limits on that. So at least from exchanges with my friends and colleagues and members of the family and looking at the social media, at least in my bubble, democracy in Ukraine is about democracy in Ukraine first, and the relations with the West, with the United States, that's more imagined in geopolitical terms than in the terms of democratic solidarity.
Yes, the woman in the corner there.
Hello. As a first-year student of physics and mathematics, I'm probably the least qualified person in this room, but it was an absolute pleasure listening to your talk. And my question is if, in your opinion, this lack of a tradition of democracy in Russia can partially explain why we don't see widespread internal opposition among Russian civilians to the regime.
I think that what we see to a degree is, and historically that has been true for a long period of time, that there are at least two Russias. And the Russia that we often imagine, or the Russia that we are in touch with, would be the Russia associated with the high culture and the capitals of Moscow and St. Petersburg and people from academia, which are traditionally, for a long period of time, much more liberal than the rest of the country. And when it came to the protests, first against the return of President Putin to power after he changed constitution, this is associated with Moscow and with Bolotnaya. And then we had the protests with the start of the war in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, also in a number of other cities. And significant part of those Russians, they left Russia. And in that sense, what we see is really the commitment to the ideas of liberalism and democracy on the part of a very small group of people that we are in touch with, and really in historical terms rejection of these ideas by the population at large. We have this narrative that I really think is very misleading about Russia and Russian people constantly being captured by some evil regime where the Russian people are the main victims. And this is just one regime replaces another, and there is no end to that. Well, we don't treat any other country by being captured by a regime. We treat in the majority of the countries as the countries producing the government that would, to a degree, reflect the historical or political orientation of the majority of the population. Only Russia gets a different treatment, and this is misleading treatment. The country didn't live under democracy almost ever. What passed for democracy were a period of revolutionary change that eventually brought back the counter-revolutionary elements, more conservative elements, again and again and again. So that's why I'm, when it comes to the immediate change in Russia, I'm very pessimistic in terms of Russia becoming democracy. My best case scenario is the regime becomes, in historical terms, overnight all sorts of transformations can happen, but something that stays would become actually more tolerant for different perspectives, positions, including for the democratic and pro-democratic parties, and those people would not end up to be killed or being imprisoned and so on and so forth. That's the for me would signify progress in Russia. Thank you.
And I'd like to say that although you're a physics and math student, it's not too late. You could still study political science. Yes.
Olga Andrzejewski, Professor Emeritus, Trent University. There's a certain sense in which Putin's policy in Ukraine has been an abject failure. Starting with the meddling before the Orange Revolution, the Melnychenko tapes, the attempt to bring down Kuchma. In a certain sense, Yanukovych was the epitome of Putin's power and influence in Ukraine. I mean, he was the perfect sort of satrap, and yet couldn't maintain himself in power. The invasion of Ukraine was based also on the same assumption shared by Western leaders that Ukraine would crumble, that there would be a certain segment of the quote-unquote Russian East that would meet the Russian armies with flowers and bread. Is there any sense in which this really is just Putin's war, that is, that it ends with him, that it's his legacy rather than the broader elite? Do you have any sense that there might be an appetite within Russia to end this war and sort of reestablish Russia's normal place in the world?
Thank you. Putin is an autocrat, right? But he's a politician. He's a politician. Elections and approval is still important for him. Unexpectedly for him, the annexation of the Crimea produced miracles for his ratings and his support among the Russians. So the war in 2014 with expectation to do the same what happened with the Crimea, with the entire Ukraine within the 2 weeks, was also the way to improve his standing in the Russian society at the time when the end of the economic reforms was producing more and more economic difficulties. The Russians who were accustomed to the economic growth, particular economic growth of the first and second terms of Putin, were now complaining that the growth was not happening there, that kleptocracy was there. So Putin just honestly was trying to deliver to the Russian people what Russian people wanted and liked. They didn't wanted the war where they would be beaten, where there would be now more than 500,000 people killed or wounded. But that was also not the plan. So in that sense, the war is Russian war on Ukraine, not Putin's war. But that being said, given how the war is going today, I actually don't see this war continuing if Putin is not in power anymore, because it didn't produce the results that Putin wanted. If it would be another Crimea, that would be certainly encouraging for whoever is in the office to continue on the same track. But now not. This war does terrible things to Ukraine, but it doesn't do anything good to Russia at all. So it's a self-defeating course on which Putin continues because he owns this war. He wants to turn things around. That's the way also of the survival of the regime. He changes Russia in the course of this war, and to think that the war, if it ends today, Russia would go back to where it was in 2022, it will not happen as well. So Russia is now much more autocratic than it used to be, and much more controlled by the state authorities. But again, at the end of the day, the end, if the war doesn't end earlier, the end of Putin, not even the regime. Personally, Putin retires or someone decides to take him out, that would be the end of the war, because no one would have enough power, political power in Russia to continue the war that is so damaging to Russia itself.
Hi, I have the microphone if you don't mind. Sorry. Hi, my name is Sophie. I am a second-year master's student in the Center of European and Eurasian Studies. And so I wanted to ask you, as you're speaking, of course, about how democracy is such a core value in Ukraine, how does that affect Ukraine's relationship with Western nations whose faith in democracy, especially with the rise of populism, such as the US, is waning, especially with Trump? Does that at all affect the support that will be generated in those other Western countries for Ukraine?
Thank you. It is difficult for me to say, but generally whatever happens in the United States or even or what's happening in Poland and the horrible things in Hungary, the discourse doesn't change. Every government is there to continue to support democracy and democratic values. What happened practically, that's a different story. In terms of the support of the democratic countries toward Ukraine, I think that, again, the fact that Ukraine is a democratic state and defends democracy matters a lot for democracies, because that's something that people actually associate themselves with. So the outpouring of the support for Ukraine was also associated with the fact that people in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, recognized in Ukrainians people like themselves on different levels, from the looks to cultural issues to the commitment to the democracy. So it is a big factor. But this is not the only factor. It's like we were talking about whether Ukraine fights just for democracy or for something else. The Western countries are there to support Ukraine partially because of the democratic values. But geopolitics and the security of those countries are in the driving seat. That's also partially why you see that the Baltic states and Poland that are on the front line are the strongest supporters of Ukraine. That's also why Europe after 22 is actually turning around, because Europe also realizes that Russia presents the threat not only to the democratic processes in their countries, but also to their security. With arsenals being blown up, with all these terrorist acts that are happening in the Baltic Sea, with the latest was the Chinese ship with the Russian crew damaging cables on the bottom of the Baltic Sea. So I would think that democracy, that's where the European countries in particular started supporting Ukraine, and now is the security considerations for them that become more and more important. And again, for the sake of lectures dedicated to democracy versus geopolitics and military component and economic, we separate those things. But in real life, they're all interconnected, influencing each other. Yeah, I see that there is, yeah, over there.
I'm Tim Snyder, I'm a historian. So Serhii, I was trying to put my finger on what was troubling me about the talk, and I think I finally got it. And it's your humility. And I think in a way, there's a missing kind of metaphysical or moral element to all this, which your humility might be connected to. So one way that you could have structured this lecture would have been to argue that Ukraine is one of the very few countries in the world that over the course of the last 30 years has become more democratic. And that would be true. Very few of us in this room are citizens of countries that have become more democratic in the last 30 years. My own is notably less democratic. In that sense, Ukraine is actually quite exceptional. But you refuse any sort of exceptionality narrative. You stay squarely in the kind of comparison with Russia, which I would submit as a very humble way of presenting the whole story. And I want to suggest that humility may actually have a kind of causal power in your analysis. So if we consider Russia in the 1990s and Ukraine in the 1990s again, one of the things which is different is scale and ambition, where Russia can only be Russia if it's a great power like the United States. And Russia has outlets, not just in Ukraine, but also in Syria, to show that it's an imperial power. And of course, once you get caught in this imperial trap, it's almost impossible to find your way back to democracy. But I think the humility is also connected to these questions that Frank and a couple of others have posed about the United States. It's connected to what is meant by democracy. So often when people, especially in the language I'm speaking, talk about democracy, what they really mean is themselves and whatever they happen to be doing at that particular moment. They're unable to get around the sense of their own exceptionalism or even narcissism, and to recognize that democracy always has a metaphysical component. It must always involve a certain element of risk-taking. And I think part of the problem that American, if you like, democracy has had with Ukraine has been the recognition of that. Whether it's the Biden administration from the beginning not believing that people would take risks for democracy, which was, in my view, the underlying reason why most Americans thought it would be over in 3 days. Or whether it's people around Trump who are so cynical, nihilistic, and self-absorbed that they can't imagine anyone taking a risk for anything and are therefore, in a strange way, intimidated by Ukrainians. And so to speak, don't want to have them in the room or in the conversation because the notion that somebody would actually care about something enough to take a risk for it is inconceivable to them. So the question is, would you share this notion that part of the success of Ukrainian democracy has to do with these more ethical considerations, and that part of the problem on people looking at it from the outside is that we fail to see that?
Yes, thank you. I will try to work on humility issue. I will do per day in the morning probably a 2-hour non-humility workshop. I will have to figure out what exactly I will be saying, but I will try to work on that. In terms of the really Ukrainian democracy and commitment and readiness to risk life and taking democracy over well-being, of course there is a threat to the established democratic regimes with the fallen numbers of people voting in those elections, with the ideas that this is certainly not something that you are prepared to risk anything. I also think that this is an attitude, and I encountered it more than once when it comes to, in particular, American diplomats. The idea is it's partially coming from the Cold War era that, okay, those countries are trying to exploit ideology or try to exploit value issues to get us involved in another conflict, in another war. And we are realpolitik, Mearsheimer sort of thinkers, and there is no place for this democratic or any other value motivations in our actions. Clearly, there is an attempt to protect thinking, decision making, and also the moral comfort of people representing large and established democracy from that challenge coming from Ukraine. And the biggest question from Ukraine is actually how you play or you don't play the card of democracy, despite the fact that, as I said, for Ukraine itself, it's not for the sake of the United States, Canada, or a system. For Ukrainians themselves, it's extremely important. This is a value that is important for the way how they imagine the existence today and continuing existence tomorrow. So that's clash of two attitudes, at least, to democracy is part of the problem in this war and part of the lack of adequate support for Ukraine. So thank you, and as I said, I will be working on the humility issue.
Would you rather recognize people yourself, Terry, or should I?
Well, I recognized some, and three people from those whom I recognized already had chance to ask questions. So I would be happy if you would.
Okay, yes, go ahead.
I meant recognize literally, not. Yeah.
First of all, дуже вам дякую.
Прошу.
Just thanking the speaker for the lecture. My question is going to be a little bit less academic. Oh, I'm sorry, for context. So Lasha and I, we lead an organization, Media Aid. We basically pay to get sappers trained in demining so they can do so safely. So we travel back and forth, and this is where my question comes from because it's about elections, which I presume is what we want to talk about in terms of democracy. Yes, the Constitution is axiomatic that the election will not take place while there's a state of war. And even though we would want that war to end very quickly, all of us, I should include, it would appear that it may take longer than any of us want, which means that the election will be postponed for a much longer period of time. And while many believe that and accept that this is what the Constitution requires, we are starting to hear, because we travel back and forth, and since we're not as famous as some, we get to talk to some very regular people, and we are starting to hear little glimmers and doubts. When do those glimmers and doubts about the deferral of the election, when does that become more dangerous and something that President Zelensky and others need to really think about, given that the Constitution does not allow for the election, but the people are wanting it? When does that happen?
Thank you. Well, Ukraine is, in terms of the modern state, it's a very new democracy. And it really performed much better than its neighbors and many non-neighbors. But 30 years of experience and tradition, if you have 3, 4, 5, 6 years of war, that can be broken. I was talking about Russia under the Putin's regime now in the last 3 years, that it is a different country. Ukraine is a different country as the result of the last 3 years. So it's a real question, it's a real concern. My understanding is that it's anecdotal. It's talking to members of my family, talking to my friends. There is no any kind of a data. People to whom I talked were against any elections in the spring as a destabilizing force. So basically the idea was that we should stick to the Constitution. We should stick what is in the law. My understanding, also unsupported by anything, was that the presidential administration was not against elections. After all, they control the marathon, the main channels. This is the time when probably most of the Ukrainians would vote for the existing president. But that's not was the attitude of the people. What I hear, I heard when I was last time I was in May in Ukraine. What I continue here now, a lot of people in the political class. They are unhappy. They want elections. They want to be in the parliament. They want to be in the government. So my experience, maybe it's not representative at all. So people in the political class would want the elections. People who are going to vote actually think that now it's not a time. But circling back where I started, yes, 3-year, 4-year period of no elections and limit on the political activity one way or another, or on the freedom of information. This is a serious, very serious change to a challenge to a young democracy.
Okay, so who hasn't yet had a chance to speak? Okay, yes. Go ahead. In the second row, and then we'll
Hi. You had mentioned before about Russia and the internal problems that they're having right now. Do you have any information as to what is the economic situation right now? I've heard, for example, that interest rates in Russia have gotten really high. The ruble is going down because of the price of oil is going down. And Putin is really indebted to China right now to help in his efforts. And what sort of what kind of effect would the China-Russia relationship have, do you think, on the continuing of this war?
I think I'm not an economist. I probably will read the same articles, the same newspapers. And my understanding, and also from based on the comments that I get from some of my colleagues in Ukraine, is that, and also in the International Monetary Fund and Bank of Reconstruction, European Bank of Reconstruction, is that the Russian economy is in trouble, but they probably still go for another maybe year, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit longer, before problems would start serious. Once the war is over, there is another potential problem for the Russian economy, how to get back into the pre-war state. So there are the biggest risks for Russia today are of the economic nature. They found the way how to recruit people into the army and send to the front, but the price of that to the economy is extremely high. The role of China in that story, again, most of Russian transactions today, I understand, are happening in yuan. So the Chinese banks are extremely important, and they're imposing more and more controls, being concerned about the secondary American sanctions. So I don't think I'm opening something particularly new. That my wisdom comes from the same source as your question comes. China is also a very important factor in what we all, or many of us, discussed today, the potential use of the nuclear weapons by Russia. That's most of the observers believe that this is certainly not in China's interests, and that the China exercise some sort of restraint and influence on, in that sense, positive influence on Putin and Russia. So that's another factor, and the reason behind this argument, if it's correct, is that China is not on par with the United States and Russia. There are still two nuclear superpowers in the world. China, which is an economic superpower, is a distant third. It's nuclear dwarf. China is not interested today in nuclear, in any sort of conflicts going nuclear in one way or another. So that's if China indeed is performing the role that I just discussed, that's one of the reasons why it is doing that.
Sarkozy, and I'm just wondering if you can comment on the Budapest Agreement, which is signed in, I think, 2010.
Budapest 94 on the denuclearization of Ukraine?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Ukraine is a country that had physical control over the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. The nukes were taken away from Ukraine by the United States. Russia was trying to do that. It didn't succeed. The United States moved in. And the reached an agreement with the Ukrainian government, eventually forcing them to give up nuclear weapons. the assurances of territorial integrity and security that were provided actually didn't mean anything. The United States knew that from the start-go. They're just paragraphs that were copy-paste from the UN Charter and other international agreements and other documents. So US is directly responsible for leaving Ukraine without nuclear deterrent, creating a security vacuum in the center of Europe that eventually produced the largest war in Europe since 1945. But legally, either US or United Kingdom or even China that signed, they're not liable. What in the Ukrainian and Russian text were translated as guarantees, in the English language were assurances. Assurances means basically that if the country wants to intervene, it can do that. If it doesn't want, it can actually stay on the side. So there is partially because of that in the media today and maybe yesterday, even Reuters were writing about that, where the United States was supposed to or were going to return the nuclear weapons to Ukraine, and then there was a statement that no, of course the United States were not going to do that. But that discussion we are having it today and yesterday and the few days before that is because of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. So the US, of course, did that in the context of stopping nuclear proliferation. Again, we can discuss what that meant really in the case of Ukraine. That was the issue of security for the United States, for the world in general, but that was also the way how it was done. When the one deterrent was removed and other deterrent in the form of either guarantees or NATO membership or anything else was not provided, that was an invitation for the war that we got today. Yeah. It's Putin or someone else, but to get some agreement. Sure. The answer to the second part of the question, what is now on the table, I don't know. What was there at the beginning was the situation in which there was a number of meetings. The one or two were in Belarus in late February and then early March of 2022. And then there was a meeting in Istanbul in late March of 2022. And there was the draft that was not signed, which basically was in exchange for the end of the hostilities, Ukraine would take on itself responsibility of cut its armed forces, not to get any support from the Western countries, and in fact actually being at Russian mercy. So the Ukrainians didn't sign that. Putin has this draft that he is now showing to the world, and he is saying that he is prepared to negotiate on the basis of allegedly agreed conditions in Istanbul in March of 2022. What we hear from the camp of the incoming American future president, past and future president Donald Trump, is the ideas of ending the war on the current front line, for Ukraine renouncing for at least 20 years plans to join NATO, but the Western countries providing some sort of guarantees of Ukrainian security. What we hear from Moscow coming at that time is that actually there is no chance for anything of that sort of happening. The 4 Ukrainian oblasts are already part of Russia, or supposed to be part of Russia according to the Russian constitution, and that the only deal that can be made on the basis of these negotiations that were happening in Istanbul in 2022. So that's what we get from Washington, what we get from Moscow. From Kyiv, Zelensky says now that he insists on part of Ukraine that is under the control of Kyiv, under the Ukrainian government, joining NATO, using the model that was used with the Western Germany joining NATO. So that's the latest what came from Zelensky. So clearly there will be some sort of negotiations. Whether they will lead anywhere or not, it's a big question. As a historian, I can say that negotiations that ended Korean War were going for 2 or 3 years. The same was with Vietnam. And in Korea, it took also the death of Stalin and the election of the new president, Dwight Eisenhower, to finalize the agreements. So the idea that if negotiations start today or tomorrow, they will produce the results the day after that, everything is possible, but I would say highly unlikely.
I would like for the last 2 questions to be from students, if there's still students who haven't had a chance to speak. Miss?
Hi, I'm Ivan. I'm a researcher here, but I'm originally from Kyiv Mykhailo Academy, so therefore my question is about nationalism. And would you say that European values and democracy were a bit of a bigger topic in 2014, whereas in 2022 a question of colonization and decolonization in regards to Ukraine national idea and separation from Russia come up? Or would you say they were evolving hand in hand and cannot be inseparable? Thank you.
I think that really probably it's easier to do a content analysis or look for the particular terms in the Ukrainian media or social media. My guess is that clearly the democracy was much more of a concern during the either Orange Revolution or the Revolution of Dignity, because the democracy, the elections, the fairness of the elections, those values were under attack within Ukraine itself. Now the attack coming from outside, and it of course brings the destruction of democracy, but it also brings the destruction of life. It also brings the destruction of the habitat. So it's the issues of the survival also on the biological level that are there. And the issues of decolonization and dealing with the Russian legacy, including cultural legacy, that's a classic example of the war for independence, the story of the emergence of the former dependent countries and regions from the shadow of the former empires. So that's why the term decolonization is not really of Ukrainian origins. That's something that we all dealt with, or our predecessors in the 60s and 70s. That was part of this global phenomenon associated with the collapse of the European empires after World War II. So the issue of decolonization, Russian language and Russian culture, for me indicate that, again, what we deal in this war, at least part, maybe the biggest part of the story, is the story of the collapse of empire and emergence of independent states.
Okay, one final question. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Rihanna. I'm PhD in International Relations, and my question about the current state of affairs of Ukraine democracy. You mentioned Orange Revolution and Revolution of Dignity, which were most powerful stimulus or demonstration, expression of Ukrainian democratic values. We see, unfortunately, Ukraine paid very high value, high price for that, but Ukraine is not the only country which was invaded by Russia. We see what is happening today in Georgia. So my question is, in post-war Ukraine, how do you see the transformation of democratic values? Will they change? Because all of the countries that were marked by Russia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Moldova, somehow they have very powerful struggle between pro-Russian and pro-European political powers. How do you see the model of democracy of Ukraine after war? Thank you.
Thank you. I believe that Ukraine would not be continue as a country, united country and independent country unless the system stays and remains to be democratic. That would go, for me as a historian, not just against the tradition established in the last 30 plus years, but generally the Ukrainian regionalism and suspicion toward the state that is the product of the history, not just for decades, but for the centuries. So from looking at that as a historian, I have difficulty imagining Ukrainians being ruled by the authoritarian regime of the domestic origin. The annexation and the taking over of Ukrainian territories, like happened with the Donbass, with Crimea, with southern Ukraine, and eradication of democracy, that's not just a possibility, this is something that is happening, and that's also happening. But if Ukrainians are left to their own devices to define the way how they want to live and how they want to govern this place, I basically have difficulty imagining authoritarianism there. That doesn't mean that the threat is not there. And the longer war goes, the stronger the challenges will be. I will turn now on the head the argument that I was making a few minutes ago about the relation between Ukraine and Europe and that and the role of democracy in that. The trick is that despite the fact that Ukraine are fighting for democracy now, not with the goal of actually somehow please their Western allies, including European ones, but Ukrainian survival next to Russia, in economic terms, in terms of the security systems, will depend on the relations with Europe and European structures. Europe is a club of maybe not ideal, maybe partially failing, but club of democracies. So there is also this additional international incentive for Ukraine to stay democratic, which would support the democratic traditions that had been established. So I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what will happen. I know the dangers are very real. But as a historian and also looking at the neighborhood in which Ukraine is now and what is needed for Ukraine's survival, I am not just cautiously, I'm quite optimistic about the future of Ukrainian democracy.
On my own behalf and on behalf of both the Department of Political Science and the Monk School and our partners across the border, I want to thank all of you for coming. I've suggested to my colleagues in the States that they emulate us by holding an extended discussion period, but I have to report that so far they're chicken. But I'm going to adduce today's events, today's session as proof that this really is a very valuable aspect of the lecture. And certainly you did not wilt under scrutiny. So please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you.